Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation. The attack was deliberately planned.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor is indeed a day that has lived in infamy. So too has the legacy of the domestic turmoil that it ensued thereafter. Newspaper articles were published informing the public of the death tolls and rallying people to the war effort. This sense of solidarity, however, ironically resulted in the singling out of an entire group of people, Japanese Americans. Subsequent to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, suspicion of Japanese Americans grew, turning into an anti-Japanese sentiment. This was evident in, and perhaps even provoked by, much of the media that was produced at the time. Newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst, for instance, wrote his column in which he rallied people to the war effort, while providing some rather unflattering representations of Japanese people as a whole. The propaganda didn't stop at the newspapers either. Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, also contributed to the support of the war effort through unflattering depictions of Japanese persons. Even Bugs Bunny played his part. And so did Batman, in the serial in which his arch-nemesis is a Japanese crime lord whom the government failed to place in an internment camp when they were rounding up the shifty-eyed Japs.
Since a wise government rounded up the shifty-eyed Japs, it has become virtually a ghost street where only one...
With all this anti-Japanese sentiment taking precedence, President Franklin Roosevelt thought it best to issue martial law under which the Secretary of War could prescribe military areas. This allowed the American government to push Japanese residents out of those areas and into a designated centralized location, an internment camp, if you will. Needless to say, many individuals had to abandon their jobs and businesses with no guarantee of receiving them back. And following the war, many Japanese American citizens ended up having to rebuild their lives. And it wasn't until 1980 that legislation was signed to investigate the Executive Order 9066. The group that was tasked with this was known as the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, and they reported their findings in their publication entitled Personal Justice Denied. Referencing these excerpts, you can see that Japanese internment was only supported by theory, which imposed otherness upon Japanese Americans without any empirical basis. It was all based on musings that loyalty was determined by ethnicity, and that individuals of Japanese descent were so alien to American patterns of thought and behavior, so it would be impossible to ascertain where their loyalty lay. Throughout the document, it is recorded that there was no clear threat to national security from Japanese Americans. However, measures were taken to justify internment, rather than face a potential public relations nightmare. In years to come, the mistake, as President Ronald Reagan called it, was admitted and attempts at reparation were made.
The internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors.
Reparations continued to be made even during the Clinton administration. In his letter addressed to the living former residents of the camps, President Bill Clinton expresses desire to right a wrong of the past, concluding that such actions were rooted in hysteria, and we must learn from the past to build a better future. Such is the case today with the recent executive order drawn up by President Donald J. Trump. As the language of the document suggests, this order was put in place to ensure that there is an adequate process to determine whether or not anyone entering the country poses a threat. And in order to accomplish this, there would be a temporary suspension on entry into the United States for persons from designated countries. Though the language of the order suggests that this is done in the name of national security, it has the country divided.
But he said there's no evidence that any of the people from these 7 countries have committed fatal terrorist attacks, and that the argument about national security doesn't hold much weight.
And pop culture icons in the form of pseudo-news anchors push the perspective of their respective parties.
The executive order entails because they're too lazy. The order temporarily stops refugee admissions for 120 days to improve the screening process and figure out who the hell is coming in.
Putting his so-called Muslim ban into effect. Let's take the time to explain what the ban means. Hey, Donald. Even though you said your ban was to protect America from outside threats, that ban included people with green cards. Now, because Donald Trump put this thing together with all the consideration of a drunken Vegas wedding.
Though the debate rages on, one thing can be certain. When taking any action in the name of national security, fear and hysteria should not supersede rationality and fact, for allowing it to do so could result in the nation doing irreparable harm to those whom it should protect. This is what we have learned from history.